"He's trash, Margaret," my ex-husband said loud enough for everyone at the Christmas table to hear. A janitor at nearly 70? You really know how to lower your standards. My children laughed. Not awkwardly. Not nervously. They truly laughed, as if the man sitting beside me was some kind of holiday joke they had all agreed to share before I arrived. But Daniel only smiled and slowly folded his linen napkin beside his untouched plate, and for the first time that evening, I realized something dangerous was hiding behind that calm expression. The dining room glowed with soft golden Christmas lights reflected against the polished cherrywood walls of Emily's house. Snow drifted quietly outside the giant bay windows overlooking the neighborhood lake, and somewhere in the living room, Nat King Cole was singing about chestnuts roasting on an open fire. The entire house smelled like cinnamon, rosemary, and expensive candles Emily probably bought because some influencer online told her they looked luxurious. Everything about the evening was designed to appear perfect. Perfect family. Perfect holiday. Perfect children. Perfect memories. But families like ours were experts at decorating rot with ribbons. I should have known the night would go wrong the moment Emily opened the front door and stared at Daniel's coat before she looked at his face. "Oh," she said, forcing a smile. "I didn't realize he was coming too." Daniel simply handed her the pie we brought and thanked her for inviting us. He always remained polite. That was one of the things I loved most about him. The world could spit at his shoes and somehow he would still answer with kindness. Richard appeared moments later holding a glass of bourbon, already wearing the smug expression that had once controlled 27 years of my life. My ex-husband had always believed money made him superior to everyone else in the room. Even now, retired and softer around the waist, he carried himself like the king of every conversation. "Margaret," he said with fake surprise. "You actually brought him." Daniel extended his hand. "Good to see you again, Richard." Richard glanced at Daniel's hand but never shook it. "Likewise," he muttered before walking away. I felt the embarrassment rise slowly into my chest, hot and familiar, like an old wound reopening exactly where it had before. 20 years ago, I would have apologized for bringing someone Richard disapproved of. 20 years ago, I would have begged for peace at that table. But divorce changes a woman. Loneliness changes her even more. We sat through dinner surrounded by silver candle holders, expensive wine glasses, and the sound of people talking over each other without truly listening. Emily kept praising Jason's new Tesla. Jason kept talking about stock investments and ski trips to Aspen. Richard interrupted every story with one of his own. And through it all, Daniel remained quiet beside me, occasionally smiling whenever I touched his hand under the tablecloth. I noticed little things as the night dragged on. Emily gave Daniel the folding chair instead of one from the dining set. Jason asked him if cleaning schools paid well these days. Richard repeatedly referred to him as maintenance. Nobody asked Daniel a real question. Nobody cared who he was beyond the uniform they imagined him wearing. Then came the moment I knew I would never forget. Emily accidentally knocked over her glass of red wine near the end of dinner. It spilled across the white table runner and dripped onto the hardwood floor. Before anyone else moved, Jason laughed and pointed toward Daniel. "Hey, at least we've got a janitor here tonight." More laughter. Real laughter. Even Emily covered her mouth trying not to smile. I froze. My fork remained halfway to my plate as heat climbed into my face. Daniel quietly reached for a towel without saying a word. "Honestly," Richard added while swirling his bourbon, "that's probably the most useful thing he's done all evening." The room exploded again. I looked at my children. My own children. The same children I stayed awake nursing through fevers. The same children I drove across town for soccer games and piano recitals. The same children I protected after Richard left our marriage bleeding and hollow. They would not even look at me now. They laughed with him instead. Daniel cleaned the spill calmly, then returned to his seat. He adjusted his sleeves and gave me a small reassuring smile, but something behind his eyes had changed. Not anger. Not humiliation. Something quieter. Something colder. Richard leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. So tell me, Daniel, he said loudly, what exactly does a woman like Margaret see in a janitor? The room fell silent. Even the Christmas music seemed distant suddenly. Daniel looked at Richard for several seconds before answering. Probably the same thing people fail to see in each other when they only look at titles. Richard smirked. That sounds deep. Jason snorted into his wine glass. Daniel nodded slowly. Sometimes the people sitting closest to you know the least about who you are. Nobody answered him. Outside, snow continued falling softly against the dark December sky while the fire crackled in the living room. Emily stood and began clearing dishes too quickly, desperate to move the evening along. But Daniel leaned back in his chair, folded his hands together, and smiled again. That smile unsettled me this time. Because suddenly I realized he wasn't embarrassed at all. He was waiting. The moment Daniel said he was waiting, I felt something shift beneath the surface of that Christmas dinner, like thin ice beginning to crack under polished shoes. Nobody else seemed to notice it yet. Emily continued stacking plates too loudly. Jason poured himself another glass of wine even though his cheeks were already flushed pink from bourbon. Richard leaned back in his chair with the lazy confidence of a man who believed he had already won every room he entered. But Daniel sat perfectly still beside me, calm in a way that suddenly made everyone else feel restless without understanding why. The firelight flickered softly across his face while snow drifted beyond the windows in slow white spirals. I reached for my water glass because my hands needed something to do. I will help with the dishes, I said quietly, mostly because I needed an excuse to leave the table before the humiliation settled any deeper into my chest. Emily barely glanced at me. That is okay, Mom. Daniel already seems qualified for cleanup duty. Jason laughed into his drink again. I saw Richard smile without lifting his eyes from his bourbon. It was such a small moment. Such a casual cruelty. That was always how families destroyed each other. Not through screaming matches or dramatic betrayals. Through tiny humiliations repeated so often they became tradition. Daniel stood before I could answer. I do not mind helping, he said gently. Actually, I enjoy cleaning. It calms my mind. Emily handed him a stack of plates immediately, as if she had been waiting all evening for permission to treat him like hired staff. I watched him walk toward the kitchen carrying expensive china while my daughter followed behind him without a trace of embarrassment. Somewhere deep inside me, something old and painful reopened. For years after my divorce, I blamed myself for the way my children treated me. I told myself Richard had poisoned them against me. I told myself divorce confused children, even adult children. But sitting there beneath twinkling Christmas lights while my fiancé carried dirty dishes away from people who mocked him, I realized something far worse. My children were no longer confused. They were simply comfortable being cruel. Richard swirled the ice in his glass and glanced toward the kitchen. You know, he said casually, I almost respect him for sticking around tonight. Most men would have left already. I stared at the candle melting beside my plate. Most men would not have needed to endure this. Richard shrugged. Come on, Margaret. We are just joking around. You always were too sensitive. That sentence alone nearly transported me 20 years backward. Too sensitive. Richard used those words every time he embarrassed me at parties. Every time he flirted with younger women in front of me. Every time he disappeared for entire weekends claiming he needed space. By the end of our marriage, I believed my pain itself was the problem instead of the man causing it. Jason loosened his tie and checked his phone. Dad is right. Nobody hates Daniel. We are just surprised, that is all. Surprised by what? I asked quietly. Jason looked uncomfortable for half a second before answering. You used to have standards, Mom. I felt my throat tighten, but before I could speak, Daniel returned from the kitchen carrying a tray of coffee cups with the same calm expression he had worn all evening. Emily followed behind him, scrolling through her phone. Everybody smile, she announced suddenly. Christmas photo. Richard straightened immediately. Jason adjusted his sweater. Emily positioned herself beside the fireplace while Daniel quietly set the coffee tray down near the table. Oh, Emily said, glancing at him awkwardly. Maybe Daniel can take the picture. Silence settled over the room for one painful second. Daniel smiled softly. Of course. He reached for the phone without hesitation. I watched my family gather together beneath the stockings hanging over the fireplace while Daniel stood outside the frame holding the camera. Nobody invited me to move beside him. Nobody noticed I remained seated alone at the table. Emily counted down cheerfully. 3, 2, 1. The flash filled the room. And suddenly I saw everything clearly. The perfect family portrait. Richard at the center. Jason beside him. Emily glowing in front of the Christmas tree. Matching sweaters. Crystal glasses. Warm lighting. And me sitting several feet away beside a man they considered invisible. Daniel handed Emily her phone back carefully. Beautiful picture, he said. Emily smiled at the screen. It really is. Then she laughed quietly while zooming into the photo. Actually, this is kind of funny. It looks like Mom brought one of the staff members to Christmas dinner. Jason nearly spit out his drink laughing. Richard covered his smile with one hand, pretending he was trying to remain polite. I looked toward Daniel instantly, terrified that this would finally be the moment his dignity cracked. But he only reached for his coffee cup slowly and took one calm sip. Then he looked directly at Emily with an expression so unreadable it sent chills through me. You should save that picture, he said softly. Years from now, it may remind you who people truly were that night. The room went strangely quiet after that. Even Richard seemed uncertain how to respond. The Christmas music continued floating softly through the house while snow thickened outside the windows, covering the neighborhood in silence. Then the doorbell rang. And the second Daniel heard it, I saw something change in his eyes again. Not fear. Recognition. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house so sharply that everyone stopped moving for a moment. Emily lowered her wine glass. Jason glanced toward the hallway. Richard frowned immediately, annoyed by the interruption as if the entire evening belonged to him personally. But Daniel did not look surprised at all. He slowly placed his coffee cup onto the table and looked toward the front door with the same quiet expression he had worn all evening. Are you expecting someone? I asked softly. Daniel looked at me for a second before answering. Not exactly. Emily brushed invisible crumbs from her sweater and walked toward the entryway, muttering something about neighbors always showing up late during the holidays. I watched Daniel carefully as the distant sound of the front door opening drifted through the house. Then came silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind that makes people stop breathing without realizing it. A few seconds later, Emily appeared again at the entrance to the dining room, but the confidence in her face had disappeared completely. Dad, she said quietly, there is someone here asking for Daniel. Richard laughed immediately. What is this? One of his janitor buddies? But Emily did not laugh back. Behind her stood an older man in a dark wool coat dusted with snow. He looked to be in his 70s, tall and sharply dressed, with silver hair combed neatly back and leather gloves tucked beneath one arm. Everything about him carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to entering important rooms without introducing himself twice. The moment his eyes landed on Daniel, his entire face softened with visible relief. There you are, he said warmly. I have been trying to reach you for over an hour. Daniel stood slowly. I turned my phone off tonight. The man smiled faintly. I assumed that. You always hated interruptions during Christmas dinner. The room remained perfectly still. Richard set his bourbon glass down harder than necessary. Jason looked confused. Emily glanced nervously between the two men as if trying to solve a puzzle she suddenly regretted mocking. Daniel walked toward the older man and shook his hand firmly. There was genuine respect between them. Not the fake politeness people use at country clubs or business dinners. Real respect. Earned respect. Margaret, Daniel said softly as he turned toward me, this is Walter Morrison. The name hit the room instantly. Even Jason straightened in his chair. Walter Morrison was not just another guest. Everybody in our city knew that name. Morrison Development owned nearly half the commercial buildings downtown, including the luxury hotel Richard constantly bragged about trying to partner with before retirement. Richard blinked hard. Walter Morrison, he repeated slowly, suddenly sounding less certain of himself than he had all evening. Walter nodded politely before looking back at Daniel. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but the board meeting was moved to Monday morning, and nobody will approve the contracts without your signature. Nobody spoke. Emily's face drained of color first. Then Jason's. Richard looked as though someone had quietly removed the floor beneath his chair. Daniel sighed softly. I told them I retired years ago. Walter smiled with tired patience. Daniel, everyone in that building still listens when you walk into a room. Richard stared openly now. Wait, he said carefully. You know each other professionally? Walter looked genuinely confused by the question. Professionally? He glanced toward Daniel before answering. Daniel built this company with me. The room seemed to shrink around us. I heard the fireplace crackling softly behind me while snow tapped gently against the windows. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody smiled. Emily slowly lowered herself into her chair as though her knees no longer trusted her. Jason looked at Daniel differently now, searching his face for signs he had somehow missed before. Richard forced out a weak chuckle. Well, that is certainly surprising. Walter frowned slightly. Surprising? His eyes moved carefully across the table, taking in the unfinished drinks, the awkward silence, the tension still hanging in the air. Then his gaze landed on the folded chair Daniel had been sitting on all evening. Something in Walter's expression changed instantly. He was too intelligent not to understand what kind of night this had been. Daniel spoke before anyone else could. Walter was just leaving. But Walter did not move. Actually, he said quietly, I think I arrived at the perfect moment. Richard cleared his throat and attempted a smile that looked painful around the edges. We were just having family jokes. Nothing serious. Walter continued looking at him for another long second before speaking. Interesting. Then he turned toward Emily. Do you know who handled the scholarship fund for your college tuition after the market crash in 2008? Emily stared blankly. Walter pointed gently toward Daniel. He did. Emily looked at Daniel so quickly her earrings shifted against her neck. What? Walter removed his gloves slowly. Your father never qualified for the refinancing package he bragged about back then. Daniel personally covered the difference quietly because he did not want your education interrupted. I felt my chest tighten. Richard looked furious now, but beneath the anger was something far uglier. Fear. Daniel finally stepped forward again, his voice calm as ever. Walter. Walter nodded once, understanding the warning. But the damage had already begun. Because for the first time that evening, my family was no longer looking at Daniel like a janitor. They were looking at him like a man they had completely failed to understand. And Richard looked like he knew something worse was still coming. Nobody moved after Walter revealed the truth about my daughter's tuition. The room sat frozen beneath the soft glow of Christmas lights while the fire crackled quietly behind us, as though the house itself was pretending not to notice the shame spreading across the table. Emily stared at Daniel with parted lips, her phone still hanging loosely in one hand. Jason looked down at his wine glass like he hoped the answer to everything might be floating inside it. Richard remained perfectly still, but I knew that look on his face. I had spent nearly 3 decades studying every expression that crossed that man's eyes. He was cornered now, and Richard hated nothing more than losing control of a room. Walter finally removed his coat and draped it neatly over the back of a chair. "I apologize if I interrupted family time," he said politely, though his tone suggested he understood exactly what kind of family gathering this had become. Daniel shook his head once. "You did not interrupt anything important." Those words landed harder than shouting ever could have. Emily swallowed visibly. "Mom," she said softly, "why did you never tell us any of this?" I almost laughed at the question because I realized something painful in that moment. My children thought the problem was that they lacked information. They still did not understand the real issue. "You never asked," I answered quietly. Silence followed again. Outside, snow continued falling across the dark lake behind the house, covering the frozen docks and empty backyards in white stillness. The neighborhood looked peaceful from the windows. Wealthy. Warm. Safe. But inside that dining room, years of arrogance were beginning to crack apart one uncomfortable truth at a time. Richard forced a chuckle that sounded brittle around the edges. "Well, if Daniel was involved with Morrison Development, why is he working as a janitor?" Walter looked toward Daniel first, almost as though asking permission to answer. Daniel only lowered his eyes briefly before nodding once. Walter folded his hands together carefully. "Because he walked away." Jason frowned. "Walked away from what?" Walter studied him for a moment. "From money. From influence. From the company itself." Jason blinked. "Nobody does that." Daniel finally spoke again, his voice calm and steady. "Some people do." Richard leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Come on. Nobody gives up millions of dollars to mop floors at a community center." Walter's expression hardened slightly for the first time. "You would be surprised what guilt can make a man abandon." The room became still again. I turned toward Daniel immediately. He kept his eyes on the tablecloth now, quietly tracing one finger along the edge of his coffee cup. I had known him for nearly 3 years, yet suddenly I realized there were entire pieces of his life he had carefully hidden behind kindness and simplicity. Not because he wanted attention. Because he wanted peace. Emily sat down slowly beside the fireplace. "Daniel," she whispered, "what happened?" He looked at her gently, and somehow that made her appear even more ashamed. "A long time ago," he said quietly, "I made choices that hurt people I loved. After that, I stopped believing success automatically made someone good." Richard scoffed softly. "That sounds dramatic." Walter's eyes snapped toward him instantly. "You should be very careful tonight, Richard." The warning in his voice startled everyone at the table. Even Richard looked unsettled now. Daniel stood slowly before the tension could tighten any further. "Walter," he said calmly, "you should head home. Roads are getting worse." Walter remained seated another second before nodding reluctantly. "Call me tomorrow morning." Daniel smiled faintly. "I will." Walter reached for his coat but paused beside me before leaving. "Margaret," he said softly, "you are sitting beside one of the finest men I have ever known." My throat tightened unexpectedly. I managed a small nod while Walter disappeared toward the front door. The house grew quieter after he left. Not peaceful quiet. Heavy quiet. The kind people fill with unnecessary movements because they cannot bear their own thoughts. Emily began stacking empty dessert plates again even though her hands trembled slightly. Jason stared at Daniel openly now, searching for clues he had missed before. Richard poured himself more bourbon with a shaky hand he tried hard to hide. Daniel returned to his chair beside me and adjusted the sleeve of his sweater calmly, as though none of this had affected him at all. I leaned closer to him. "You never told me." He smiled softly without looking at me. "Would it have changed how you saw me?" I answered immediately. "No, then it did not matter." That simple answer hurt my heart more than the insults earlier because I suddenly understood how little this man valued himself despite everything he had done for others. Emily finally sat across from us again. Her mascara looked slightly smudged now. "Daniel," she said carefully, "I am sorry about earlier." He gave her a polite nod. "Thank you." But he did not rescue her from the discomfort. He did not tell her it was fine. He simply accepted the apology and let the silence remain where it belonged. Richard suddenly stood from the table with his drink still in hand. "This whole evening is becoming ridiculous," he muttered. "Everybody is acting like Daniel is some kind of saint." Daniel looked up at him calmly. "No, Richard. Definitely not a saint." Something in the way he said those words made the room colder than the snow outside. Then Daniel slowly lifted his eyes to meet Richard's directly, and for the first time all evening, I saw genuine fear flicker across my ex-husband's face. Richard tried to recover the room the same way he always had throughout our marriage. He poured another drink, straightened his shoulders, and pretended confidence could erase humiliation fast enough for nobody to notice it happened. But something had shifted permanently at that Christmas table. The balance was gone now. Earlier in the evening, everyone laughed with him. Now nobody seemed certain where to look. Daniel remained seated beside me, calm and unreadable, while the soft white lights from the Christmas tree reflected against the windows behind him. He looked completely at peace in a room full of people suddenly afraid of what they did not know. Richard cleared his throat loudly. "You are all acting ridiculous," he muttered. "Walter Morrison walks in here for 5 minutes and suddenly Daniel becomes some mysterious hero." Jason rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Dad, nobody said hero." Richard ignored him completely. "I mean honestly," he continued, forcing a laugh, "the man still works as a janitor." Daniel looked at him quietly. "Yes. I do." Richard spread his hands dramatically. "Exactly. So let us not pretend this is some fairy tale transformation. A mop is still a mop." Emily closed her eyes briefly like she wanted the evening to end before her father embarrassed them further. But Richard had spent too many years being the loudest voice in every room. Silence frightened him more than conflict ever could. "Dad," Emily whispered carefully, "maybe just stop talking." Richard scoffed. "Oh, now I am the bad guy because I asked questions?" He pointed loosely toward Daniel with his glass. "Funny how nobody cared about honesty earlier tonight." Daniel finally stood from his chair slowly. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just calmly enough that every eye in the room followed him automatically. "Richard," he said softly, "you should sit down." The words sounded polite. But something underneath them carried weight. Richard laughed once under his breath. "Or what?" The room became very still again. Daniel folded his hands in front of him for a moment before answering. "Or you may force conversations neither of us truly wants tonight." My stomach tightened immediately. I looked at Daniel carefully. Until now, he had protected Richard repeatedly throughout the evening. I could see it clearly suddenly. Every time Walter hinted at something uncomfortable, Daniel redirected the conversation. Every time tension approached the edge of revelation, Daniel softened it. But now that patience was thinning. Richard sensed it too. That was why his face had started losing color beneath the warm dining room lights. Jason leaned forward slightly. "What conversations?" Daniel remained silent. Richard answered too quickly. "Nothing." That single word exposed him more than any confession could have. Emily looked between the two men with growing confusion. Dad? Richard slammed his glass onto the table harder than intended. There is nothing to discuss. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly, almost tired. Then let it go. But Richard could never let anything go if pride was involved. It was the reason our marriage collapsed. The reason he alienated our children without them noticing it. The reason he needed to humiliate people weaker than himself just to feel important for a few minutes. He stepped closer toward Daniel now, bourbon still in hand. No, he snapped quietly. I want to understand something. Walter Morrison practically bows when he talks to you. Apparently you paid for Emily's college. Apparently you helped build a billion-dollar company. So tell me, Daniel. Why spend your retirement scrubbing floors? Daniel studied him for several seconds before answering. Because some stains never come out. The words landed like ice water across the room. Jason frowned immediately. Emily looked confused again. But Richard looked terrified. Real terror. Small beads of sweat appeared near his temple despite the cold weather outside. I had never seen Richard afraid before. Not even during the divorce. Not even during financial crashes. But whatever Daniel meant, Richard understood it instantly. You should leave, Richard muttered suddenly. Daniel tilted his head slightly. This is your daughter's house, not yours. Richard blinked hard. Emily looked startled by the reminder. Dad, she said quietly, please stop. But Richard ignored her completely. You think because you have money people will forget who you are, he snapped toward Daniel. You think acting calm erases the past? Daniel's expression never changed. No, Richard. I know exactly what the past costs. Nobody spoke after that. Even the Christmas music from the living room seemed distant now beneath the tension filling the house. Snow continued falling outside in thick white sheets, covering the lake completely. Emily wrapped her arms around herself near the fireplace. Jason stared openly between Daniel and Richard like he was finally realizing his parents had buried entire decades of truth beneath polite family dinners and holiday photographs. Then Emily asked the question nobody else had the courage to ask. How long have you two known each other? Daniel looked toward me first. There was sadness in his eyes now. Not anger. Not revenge. Sadness. Then he turned back toward Emily slowly. Long before I ever met your mother. Richard closed his eyes briefly as if the room had suddenly become difficult to breathe inside. My heart began pounding harder because I realized something terrifying then. This was not coincidence. Daniel entering my life years after my divorce had not been random at all. And judging by the guilt slowly consuming Richard's face, whatever connected those two men had been hidden for a very long time. The air inside the dining room felt heavier after Daniel admitted he had known Richard long before he ever met me. Nobody reached for their drinks anymore. Nobody touched the desserts Emily had carefully arranged beside the fireplace an hour earlier. The candles had burned lower now, dripping wax slowly onto silver holders while soft Christmas music drifted through the house almost mockingly cheerful. It amazed me how ordinary life continued even while the truth quietly dismantled people from the inside. Richard remained standing near the table with his bourbon glass clenched too tightly in one hand. His confidence had disappeared completely now. All that remained was irritation stretched thin over panic. Emily looked pale beside the Christmas tree, and Jason had stopped pretending this was just uncomfortable holiday tension. They both knew something larger sat beneath the surface now. Something old. Something ugly. I looked toward Daniel carefully. He still carried himself with impossible calm, but I noticed the exhaustion around his eyes for the first time that evening. Not physical exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion. The kind carried by people who have spent years protecting others from truths they did not deserve protected from. What does that mean? Emily asked softly. How did you know Dad? Daniel remained silent for a moment. Richard answered first. It does not matter. Daniel finally looked directly at him. It mattered once. Richard swallowed hard. Daniel. There was warning in his voice now. Fear wrapped inside authority. But Daniel no longer seemed interested in protecting him. He slowly reached for the back of his chair and rested one hand there while snow continued falling heavily outside the windows. About 23 years ago, he said quietly, Richard and I worked together on a development project downtown. Jason frowned immediately. Dad never mentioned that. Richard snapped back too quickly. Because it was decades ago. Daniel nodded calmly. Yes. And some people hoped it would stay buried there. Emily stared between them in confusion. Buried? Nobody answered her right away. The fire cracked softly behind us. Somewhere upstairs, one of Emily's decorative Christmas villages began playing a tinny instrumental version of Silent Night. The sound felt strange against the tension suffocating the room. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. Back then, your father was ambitious. Very ambitious. Morrison Development was expanding rapidly, and Richard wanted a senior partnership position more than anything. Richard slammed his drink onto the table again. Enough. Daniel did not raise his voice. You asked why I walked away from everything. This is why. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Jason slowly leaned forward in his chair now, watching his father instead of Daniel. That detail alone told me everything had changed. Earlier tonight, my children automatically believed Richard without question. Now they were studying him carefully, noticing things they should have noticed years ago. Richard rubbed one hand across his forehead. This is not necessary. Daniel looked almost sad. It became necessary the moment you humiliated me in front of your family. The silence after that sentence felt endless. Richard opened his mouth but no words came out immediately. Emily's eyes widened slightly, like she had never considered actions could carry consequences beyond the moment they were spoken. Daniel finally continued. One night after a company event, Richard made a decision that could have destroyed his career permanently. Richard looked physically ill now. Stop. But Daniel kept speaking softly, almost gently. There had been too much alcohol. Too much arrogance. Too much belief that money protected people from consequences. Jason slowly sat back in his chair. Emily covered her mouth with one hand. I looked toward Richard, and suddenly I remembered dozens of strange details from our marriage that had never fully made sense. The sudden financial panic 20 years ago. The unexplained legal consultations. The months where Richard barely slept and snapped at everyone constantly. Back then, he told me it was business stress. I believed him because wives were trained to believe men who spoke confidently enough. Daniel looked toward me then, and I realized this part hurt him most. Not exposing Richard. Hurting me. There was an accident, he said quietly. Richard closed his eyes. Nobody moved. Daniel continued carefully, choosing every word with precision. No one died. But someone could have. Emily began shaking her head slowly. Dad? Richard stared at the floor now. Daniel volunteered to take responsibility, Daniel said. The company lawyers agreed quietly because protecting Richard protected the development deal. Jason looked stunned. What are you talking about? Daniel gave a faint smile without humor. Your father kept his position. His reputation stayed intact. His future remained untouched. Emily's voice trembled. And you? Daniel looked toward the windows where snow blanketed the dark neighborhood outside. I lost mine. The room fell silent again. Real silence this time. The kind people never forget years later. I suddenly understood why Daniel never cared about expensive clothes, status symbols, or luxury restaurants. He had already lived inside that world once and watched exactly how quickly it abandoned people when protecting someone wealthier became more convenient. Richard finally spoke again, but his voice sounded smaller now. Older somehow. You agreed to it. Daniel nodded once. Yes. Jason stared between them in disbelief. Why would you do that? Daniel looked down quietly before answering. Because at the time, I thought loyalty mattered more than truth. Nobody knew what to say after that. Not even Richard. The Christmas lights reflected softly against the windows while the snowstorm outside grew thicker, sealing the house inside a silence full of consequences that had waited more than 20 years to finally enter the room. Emily looked at her father as though she no longer recognized the man standing across the dining room from her. The Christmas lights reflected in her watery eyes while Jason sat frozen beside the fireplace, both hands wrapped tightly around a glass he had stopped drinking from 20 minutes earlier. Nobody seemed to know what to do with themselves anymore. The house still smelled like cinnamon candles and roasted turkey, but the warmth was gone now. Every polished surface in the room seemed colder somehow. Richard finally lowered himself into his chair again with the slow stiffness of a man aging in real time. He avoided looking directly at anyone. Especially Daniel. You make it sound worse than it was, he muttered quietly. Daniel remained standing beside the table, calm as ever. Do I? Richard rubbed his jaw hard. Nobody forced you to do anything. Daniel nodded once. That part is true. Emily stared at him in disbelief. You accepted blame for Dad? Daniel looked toward her gently. I accepted responsibility for a situation I believed I could survive. Jason shook his head slowly. Why would you protect him? Richard answered before Daniel could. Because we were friends. The word sounded weak in the room. Thin. Hollow. Daniel finally looked directly at Richard again, and for the first time all evening, I saw disappointment openly on his face. Not rage. Not revenge. Just disappointment so deep it almost felt heavier than anger. No, Daniel said softly. Friends do not disappear afterward. Silence settled over the table again. Emily slowly sat down beside the Christmas tree while tears gathered quietly in her eyes. I realized then that my children were not only grieving the truth about their father. They were grieving the image of him they spent their entire lives believing. Richard had always presented himself as the successful man who carried everyone else through life. The provider. The leader. The smartest person in every room. But now another version of him sat exposed beneath flickering holiday lights, and that version depended entirely on another man sacrificing everything quietly in the background. Jason finally looked at his father directly. Did Mom know? Richard answered too fast again. No, I looked down at the tablecloth for a moment, remembering all the years I spent questioning my own instincts during our marriage. All the nights Richard came home angry for reasons that never made sense. All the financial secrets. All the conversations that ended the moment I entered a room. I used to believe marriage meant trusting someone completely. Now I understood some people depended on trust specifically because they were undeserving of it. Daniel slowly sat back down beside me. Margaret was never part of this. Richard laughed bitterly under his breath. You always did love acting noble. Daniel remained calm. No. I simply learned what guilt feels like. Richard suddenly slammed both palms against the table hard enough to rattle silverware. Emily flinched immediately. You think you are better than me? He snapped. You destroyed your own life. That was your choice. Daniel looked at him quietly for several seconds before answering. Yes. It was. The calmness in his voice somehow made Richard look even more unstable. Jason stood from his chair now, pacing toward the windows overlooking the snowy lake. This is insane, he muttered. All these years, his voice trailed off. Emily wiped beneath her eyes carefully, trying not to smear mascara further. "Dad," she whispered, "did you ever even thank him?" Richard looked away immediately. That silence answered everything. Daniel noticed it too, but he only gave the faintest smile of resignation. "You do not owe me gratitude, Richard." Richard scoffed bitterly. "Oh please." Daniel folded his hands together loosely. "But you owed your family honesty." Those words struck the room harder than anything else that night because everyone understood the truth inside them instantly. This was never only about Daniel losing money or status. It was about decades of lies quietly shaping an entire family. The children who learned arrogance from their father. The wife who spent years believing she was too emotional whenever something felt wrong. The holiday dinners built on appearances instead of trust. The polished photographs hiding empty relationships underneath. Emily suddenly stood and walked toward the hallway without speaking. A moment later we heard the bathroom door close softly. Jason remained by the windows staring out at the snowstorm swallowing the neighborhood streetlights one by one. Richard poured the last of the bourbon into his glass with trembling fingers. "You came into her life on purpose," he muttered suddenly toward Daniel. My heart tightened immediately. Daniel looked surprised for the first time all evening. "What?" Richard laughed bitterly into his drink. "Do not pretend this was random. After everything that happened, after all those years, suddenly you appear dating my ex-wife?" Daniel stared at him quietly. "I met Margaret by accident at a community fundraiser." Richard shook his head hard. "I do not believe that." Daniel's expression softened slightly then, almost sadly. "That is because you still believe everything in life revolves around you." Jason turned slowly from the windows. "Dad," he said carefully, "is that true?" Richard looked trapped now. Cornered from every direction by truths he spent years outrunning. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair and spoke with gentle honesty. "I did not know Margaret was your former wife the first time we met." I looked at him immediately. "You never told me that." Daniel smiled faintly toward me. "By the time I realized who you were, I already cared about you too much to walk away." The room fell silent again. But this silence felt different from the others tonight. Softer somehow. Because for the first time since arriving at Christmas dinner, I no longer felt ashamed sitting beside Daniel. The shame belonged somewhere else now. The grandfather clock near the staircase chimed softly at 10 o'clock, and the sound seemed to pull everyone back into the room after the emotional shock of the last hour. Emily finally emerged from the hallway with fresh makeup and red eyes she tried unsuccessfully to hide. Jason returned slowly from the windows overlooking the frozen lake, his shoulders heavier than before. Nobody looked comfortable anymore beneath the warm Christmas lights and carefully wrapped presents stacked beside the tree. Earlier that evening the house had felt elegant. Now it felt exposed. Daniel remained beside me quietly, one hand resting near mine on the tablecloth, calm in a way I still could not fully understand. Most people would have used this moment to humiliate Richard publicly after years of silence. Most people would have enjoyed watching the room turn against him. But Daniel carried no victory in his expression at all. Only exhaustion. Emily sat carefully across from us again. "Mom," she said softly, avoiding my eyes at first, "I need to ask you something." I nodded once. Her voice trembled slightly. "Were you happy after the divorce?" The question surprised me because it was the first honest thing either of my children had asked me in years. I looked down at the candle burning low beside my coffee cup before answering. "Not at first." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair but said nothing. "For a long time," I continued quietly, "I thought losing my marriage meant losing my value. Your father was very good at making me believe I was difficult to love." Emily lowered her eyes immediately. Jason stared at the floor. Daniel remained silent beside me, listening the way he always listened. Fully. Then one day, I said softly, I met someone who never made me feel small in order to feel important himself. Nobody spoke after that. Richard took another drink, but his hand trembled enough now that bourbon spilled slightly against the side of the glass. Emily noticed it too. For the first time in her life, she was seeing her father as an aging man instead of an untouchable figure. That realization seemed to break something inside her. "Dad," she whispered carefully, "why did you never tell us any of this?" Richard laughed bitterly under his breath. "Because families survive by moving forward." Daniel looked toward him quietly. "No. Families survive through honesty." Richard's jaw tightened immediately. "Easy for you to say." Daniel nodded slowly. "Actually, no. It was not easy at all." Jason finally looked directly at Daniel again. "Did you hate him?" Daniel considered the question for several seconds. "For a while," he admitted softly. "But hatred becomes exhausting eventually. Especially when you realize the other person already has to live with themselves every day." Richard flinched slightly at those words even though Daniel never raised his voice. That was the thing about quiet truth. It never needed volume to wound people. Emily suddenly stood and walked toward the Christmas tree. She picked up the framed family photograph they had taken earlier that evening while Daniel stood outside the frame holding the camera. I watched her stare at it silently for a long moment. Then her shoulders began shaking. "I cannot believe we treated you like that tonight," she whispered toward Daniel. Daniel looked at her gently. People reveal themselves during moments they think do not matter. Emily wiped tears from her face quickly. "I was cruel." Daniel gave a faint nod. Yes. He did not soften the truth for her comfort. But neither did he punish her with it. That balance was what separated him from Richard. One man used truth like a weapon. The other used it like a mirror. Jason slowly walked back toward the table and looked at me with an expression I had not seen since he was a teenager. "Regret." "Mom," he said quietly, "I think we learned the wrong things growing up." My heart hurt hearing that because I knew he was right. Children do not only inherit eye color or last names. They inherit emotional habits. They inherit arrogance, silence, cruelty disguised as humor. I reached for his hand gently. "You still have time to learn different ones." Richard suddenly stood again, frustrated and restless. "So now I am the villain in some Christmas redemption movie?" Nobody answered him immediately. That silence itself became the answer. Richard looked around the room desperately, searching for someone still standing on his side. But even Emily could no longer meet his eyes. Daniel finally rose from his chair beside me and reached for his coat calmly. "Margaret," he said softly, "we should head home before the roads freeze." The simplicity of his voice somehow made the entire evening feel even sadder. After everything revealed tonight, after every insult and confession and crack in the family foundation, Daniel still wanted only peace. Not revenge. Not apologies. Peace. Emily stepped forward immediately. "Please do not leave like this." Daniel smiled kindly. "This is probably the best way to leave." Jason looked ashamed. "Can we at least make this right somehow?" Daniel slipped his coat on slowly. "That depends on whether you want forgiveness or simply relief from guilt." Nobody had an answer for that. Richard remained standing alone near the dining room table while the Christmas lights reflected against the untouched glass ornaments behind him. For the first time in decades, he looked exactly what he truly was. Not powerful. Not impressive. Just a lonely man watching the consequences of his own pride finally arrive all at once. Then Daniel gently reached for my hand, and without another word, we walked together toward the front door while snow continued falling softly outside beneath the dark December sky. The cold air outside Emily's house felt cleaner than anything inside that dining room. Snow covered the driveway in a thin white layer that sparkled beneath the porch lights while distant Christmas decorations glowed softly across the quiet neighborhood. Daniel walked beside me carefully down the stone pathway, one hand holding mine while the other steadied me against the icy steps. Behind us, through the large front windows, I could still see shadows moving slowly inside the house. My children. My former husband. A family finally forced to sit inside truths they spent years avoiding. Daniel opened the passenger door of his old pickup truck for me before brushing snow gently from the windshield with his sleeve. Nothing about him looked impressive in the traditional sense. No luxury car. No expensive watch. No performance designed to make strangers admire him. And yet standing there beneath falling snow, I realized I had never once felt safer with another human being in my entire life. He climbed into the driver's seat beside me and started the engine while soft heat slowly filled the cab. Neither of us spoke right away. The windshield wipers moved steadily across the glass as snow continued drifting through the dark December night. Finally, I looked toward him. "Why did you stay tonight?" Daniel kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Because you asked me to come." "After the way they treated you?" He smiled faintly. "Margaret, people usually reveal their character long before they realize they are being tested." I stared at him quietly while streetlights passed across his face one at a time. "You knew this would happen, did not you?" He was silent for several seconds before answering honestly. Part of me suspected Richard would eventually recognize me. "No," I whispered softly. "I mean the rest of it. My children. The humiliation. The way they laughed." Daniel tightened his hands slightly around the steering wheel. I hoped I was wrong. That answer hurt more than if he had admitted anger. Because beneath everything else tonight, Daniel had still wanted my family to be better than they were. We drove through quiet streets lined with glowing wreaths and inflatable snowmen while Christmas music played softly from the truck radio. Somewhere behind us, the storm had already begun covering our tire tracks. I suddenly realized how exhausted I felt. Not physically. Emotionally. Like I had spent years holding together an image of family that no longer existed. "I am sorry," I said quietly. Daniel glanced toward me immediately. "For what?" "For bringing you into that house." He shook his head once. "Do not apologize for other people's choices." Tears blurred my vision unexpectedly then, but I blinked them away before they could fall. "I think tonight finally broke something in me." Daniel's voice softened. "Maybe something needed breaking." We stopped at a red light near the town square where giant Christmas garlands hung from old brick buildings covered in snow. A Salvation Army volunteer rang a bell near the corner while bundled couples hurried between restaurants holding shopping bags and paper cups of hot chocolate. Life continued everywhere around us as though entire families were not collapsing quietly behind closed doors all over America tonight. My phone buzzed suddenly inside my purse. Then again. Emily. Jason. Emily again. I stared at the screen without answering. Daniel noticed but said nothing. Finally, I silenced the phone and placed it back inside my purse. "You can answer them," he said gently. I looked out the window toward the falling snow. "Not tonight." He nodded once like he understood completely. The truck continued through the storm while warm air hummed softly through the vents. After several quiet minutes, I finally asked the question sitting heavy in my chest since dinner. "Do you regret it?" Daniel frowned slightly. "Regret what?" "Taking the blame for Richard all those years ago." He considered the question carefully before answering. "I regret believing loyalty required self-destruction." I looked toward him slowly. "But I do not regret the man it forced me to become afterward." That sentence settled into me deeply because suddenly I understood something important about Daniel. The world had stripped him of status, wealth, reputation, and comfort. Yet somehow it failed to strip away his humanity. Richard experienced success and became cruel. Daniel experienced loss and became kind. That difference defined both men more than any bank account ever could. When we finally pulled into my driveway, snow had already covered the front steps and mailbox completely. Daniel turned off the engine but remained seated quietly beside me. The world outside looked soft and white and silent beneath the storm. "Your children love you," he said gently. I laughed sadly under my breath. Maybe in the way frightened people love mirrors they do not want to look into. Daniel smiled faintly at that. Then he reached over and took my hand again, warming my cold fingers between both of his. "People can learn," he said softly, "if they are willing to feel ashamed first." I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes for one brief moment, listening to the snow tap softly against the truck roof. Earlier that evening I arrived at Christmas dinner afraid my family would reject the man I loved because of his job. But somewhere between the insults, the laughter, and the truths finally dragged into the light, I realized something far more important. The poorest man at that table had never been Daniel. And for the first time in many years, I no longer felt afraid of seeing people exactly as they were.